They said this session is an hour, so I said, well, and people are going to need alcohol. Basically, this is land value tax. With property tax, they assess the value of your building. They assess the value of your land. They add the two together for the total value. And if it doesn't seem to add up, usually it's the building is in the wrong place, so the building is worth less. So a good building, a good one-story building where it's a slum and nobody would build a new building is worth less than one in a better neighborhood. But also, if you're where it is now skyscrapers or high-rise apartment buildings, your one-story building might be worth less because the normal market use of that land is to build something entirely different. So your building can be obsolete for the location. But in general, if you have a well-maintained property, your taxes are high because they're taxing your building. And if you run your property down, you get a tax break for that. And under land value tax, the location is what pays the tax. And in Pittsburgh, we did this. Originally, it was done in 1913, and I had very little to do with that. But before they went to a land value tax, Pittsburgh's housing was the second most expensive housing in the United States after New York City. And this was in spite of the fact that Pittsburgh was a very dirty coal town, famous for its pollution. It was called the Smoky City, but it was still very expensive to live there. And after they shifted to land value tax, as prices started going up in other cities, Pittsburgh remained about where it was, and it eventually became the most affordable city in the United States. Well, then we started getting other taxes. People came up with clever non-real estate taxes, and the land value tax began to be less of an effect. And in 1978, that's when I first got involved, we had a city councilman who wanted to shift to a land value tax, and we did studies for him and looked at 1978. We didn't have the computer power we have today, so I did studies with a pencil and took every 100th page of the assessment books. I wrote down the assessments of the property owner and found that most homeowners paid far less under a land value tax, but that the absentee owners tended to pay more. The very richest neighborhoods paid more, and the corporate property paid more. The skyscrapers paid less, but the buildings next to the skyscraper that were being bought up by somebody who knew that the next skyscraper would go there, he paid more. So that was what happened. In 1978 was also the year, and it's just coincidence because we already had this land tax thing going. We were ready to get it passed. The steel mills shut down. Not all of them, but many of them. The only one in Pittsburgh shut down, and the ones nearby Pittsburgh, some of those shut down as well. So we should have had something of a serious recession like Detroit is having now with the automobile. But what happened was that, whoops, this is not, let's hit page down. It's changing my page, but it's not changing your page. There it is. Okay. So the blue bar, the red bar, which is very low, is the tax on buildings, and the blue bar is the tax on land. And we increased it for 1978, and again in 1979, and construction started going up and up. And if I took this chart a year or two further, it went way up, and then it came back down some because we had a surplus of building. But whenever you have a land value tax, instead of a real estate price boom, you get a construction boom. And this is true in other cities. It was true in Denmark in the 1950s when they did it. It was true in Australia. Before we had it in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh had it, but they hadn't changed it for a long time. We went to Australian cities did it, and they did it by voter referendum. So what we advocate is you gradually lower the building tax and gradually increase the land tax, because we don't want to shock anybody. But what Australia did was passed it by voter referendum, and if your municipality passed it, your building tax disappeared overnight, and your land tax could be 3 or 4 or 5 times as high. And that gave dramatic results for the chart chasers, but it was, I think, more difficult for the property owners. I don't know that I have much sympathy for the people speculating on vacant lots, but sometimes somebody has an old property that is no longer suitable to the land use, but they've been maintaining it. And that's why if you make the transition gradual, it's less punishing to them. Whoops. This is when we have inflation. This was the housing bubble. It's really a land price bubble. The red is the residential land price, and the green is the house price, and the blue is the green is the home price, which is land and buildings. And the blue under that is the cost of the structure. Lumber gets scarce and buildings get worth more sometimes. But the yellow is the consumer price index. And what it shows is that land very much leads these price increases. And it is tied to money. When values are going up, banks are happy to lend. When banks are happy to lend, values go up. Real estate people are always fighting to get the mortgage rate lower, because then they know they can get more for their real estate. Pittsburgh missed the crash. 2005 was the peak year, but there wasn't much change till 2008. Then everything crashed, and this is 2009. Pittsburgh's prices have actually been going up some. I'm afraid that it's partly been going up because other cities have crashed and all the land speculators are running to Pittsburgh, because we actually don't have a land value tax anymore. The county sabotaged the assessments, and the house that I lived in was next to a vacant lot. Prior to this change, they both had the same land value. And then the newspaper people wrote about it and used my house as an example because I gave them the information. But the assessor said, well, your land is more valuable because you have a house on it. And I said, well, how clever of someone to put that land under that house. It made no sense, but they said, well, because of zoning, my house is grandfathered in. That the zoning wouldn't let somebody build a house like that now. But all of the property lawyers say, no, a zoning variance is a building value. If somebody else wanted to build a house like mine, they would have the added cost of going to zoning court and applying for a variance and winning the variance. And also there was a house next door to my house when the zoning law changed. But that house fell down, and when the house fell down, the variance fell down. So the variance is a building value, but that's how Pittsburgh lost it. And now we are growing in price because the land is not taxed as heavily. So people think it's a good thing that real estate values are going up in Pittsburgh, and I say no, it's a bad thing, because the next recession we will be like Detroit. This is the Great Depression, and this is different cities that this is their land prices. Detroit was hit the hardest. Their land price fell almost 60%. I think it's 58%. And then Los Angeles, Cleveland. Cleveland is in trouble again. And then some average ones. But up at the top, the red one is Washington, D.C., and the yellow one beside it is Pittsburgh. Washington dropped 12%, and Pittsburgh dropped 11%. Washington, D.C. was the boom town of the Great Depression because FDR came in, Federal government expanded like crazy. Lots of new construction in Washington, D.C., lots of bureaus and agencies. So it makes sense that Washington would be low. But Pittsburgh was a steel industry and should be going up and down with the recession. But our land prices never went up, so they had nowhere to drop. I want to make it clear that it's a land value tax, and I want to emphasize the word value. If I could put trumpets or something around the word value, I would. The picture on the left is Times Square. That shouldn't say acre. I've changed it. I meant to change it for Sweden. That should be a hectare. One square meter is worth more than an acre, substantially more. But 2 square meters is worth more than of New York State farmland is worth more than prime land in Manhattan. So always think of it as it's a location tax. It's not really a land area tax. It's a location tax. There's a thing called the tax wedge, and this is what makes companies less competitive. And all conservatives talk about the tax wedge. The tax wedge is, in addition to what you pay your employee has to pay taxes, so he doesn't get all that pay. So the yellow is the employee's spending power, and the gray at the top is the additional cost to the employer because of the employer's taxes and the employee's taxes. The difference between your purchasing power and what it costs your employer is called the tax wedge. But there's also a rent wedge, and there's a natural rent, which is in the dull green, kind of olive khaki color. There is a natural rent, which is what the rent would be if all the land was in use. If nobody was holding land out of use, there would still be a rent, because some land is better than other land. So the best land you could have for free might be in the north, where it's snowy and wilderness and there's no roads, and there's always land that you can have for free. But the better land, you pay a premium to have that advantage. But rack rent is an additional rent you pay because some people who have land are keeping it out of use, especially if they have prime land and they're holding it out of use. One of the things about Pittsburgh's land value tax is that when a factory closed, the landowner was very interested in selling the land to somebody else who would use it. Where in Detroit, when a factory closed, the landowner said, well, I'll just sit on this land for a while and wait for the recovery. And there is no recovery if everybody does that. So rack rent is that additional rent caused by a shortage of land. And housing prices in Detroit are still higher than housing prices in Pittsburgh, even though Pittsburgh has lots of employment and stuff. So if you took the tax and put it on the land value, it doesn't drive the land value up. The rack renters get out of the market, they sell. So the rack rent here is higher than the tax as it stands now. So the tax just disappears. And you still have the rent wedge, but what the employer pays for the rent and the employee is his cost. And some of that rent is the employee's rent. The employees have to pay rent as well. But once that rack rent starts to fall, as you see over here, if government spending remains the same, then you would still have some tax would be necessary. Now this is kind of a utopian view, because as you gradually make these changes, there's still taxes for a long time and there's still rent for a long time. But the philosophical goal is that government should not collect taxes on human effort at all. That human beings producing wealth should be, that was the original meaning of laissez-faire. It was not only to tell the government not to get in your way, but it was to tell the landlords to get out of the way and let people have access to land so that they could produce. Laissez-faire translates into let them produce and let them be. We pretend it just is let them be. But the original phrase was laissez-aller, laissez-passer, laissez-faire, laissez-aller, laissez-passer, which means let them produce, let them be, and let them pass, which was directed very much at the landlords. We got, most of the classical liberals were from England and France. And the reason, I believe, is because England and France settled North America and got exposure to the American Indians and did not have gold. Spain settled Central and South America, but the first thing that happened is the Aztecs welcomed them. They thought these were the gods come to save them. And the Aztecs came out with these wonderful ornaments that they made out of gold. And the Spanish got so preoccupied with the gold that they really didn't care what other things Indians had to teach us. But the northeastern Indians particularly were, the Iroquois was called the Six Civilized Tribes. These are Indians in the state of Virginia. They're not Iroquois, they're the Powhatan Indians. And we tried to, we gave their Indian king a crown of jewels, which he graciously accepted because it would be rude not to. And, but they considered it, why would a king want to wear something that heavy? So, I mean, he had his crown of sorts already. But one of the things that these classical liberal writers, well, the heck with PowerPoint. One of the things that the classical liberal writers had in common is that they frequently used American Indians as an example. And so John Locke wrote about, you have a right to land only if there is enough and is good left to others, and if not, you owe the community for the advantages your land has over the other land. Adam Smith said ground rents are a species of revenue that ought to be taxed. And the people who gave the French physiocrats, this is where the term laissez-faire came from, also gave us the impôt unique, which is single tax on land value. David Ricardo said that when Adam Smith came up with the labor theory of value, he said, assuming there's no rent. And David Ricardo created the law of rent. And the law of rent is that the value of land, especially commercial land, is equal to the advantage it has over the best free land. Well, there was no free land in England. There was no free land in France. So when the whole concept of the best free land came from America, that there was land you could go to and it was free. The American Indians didn't own land. They didn't believe in owning land. They didn't believe we should own land either. They welcomed us because as settlers and our farming methods they did farm, but our farming methods were much better than theirs. They farmed one place. It was crop rotation, but they just farmed a place and then left it and went and farmed another place. And Thomas Jefferson wrote, they had property. As long as their crops were growing, that land was their property, but as soon as the crops were harvested, anybody could use that land. So the property was actually in the crops, not in the land. And that's when people began to think that property and land was a function of the government, rather. I'm going to try to reload this thing. Of the government rather than. Okay. The guy on the right is John Locke. He's the one that said the stuff I said before. The two at the top are Quinet and Turgot. Quinet came up with land value tax, and Turgot came up with plans to implement it. Down here is Rousseau. Rousseau said the first person who found a plot of land, put some stakes around it, and called it his own was the real founder of civil society. And we might have been saved from a lot of grief if someone had said, beware of this impostor. The earth belongs to no one, and the fruits of the earth belong to everyone. The fellow on the right is Blackstone. He was the great chronicler of common law. And he said, there is no way that some writings on a parchment of paper can convey ownership of land. And David Ricardo is the fellow in the middle. He's the one who said that the rental value of land is the difference between that land and the best land you can have for free. And he also made the case that if you only taxed the rent that was being collected, it would be passed on to the user. But if you taxed all land, including land that was held out of use, it would not lead to higher rents. It would probably lead to lower rents. Let's see what we... Thomas Jefferson is on the left. He went to France and was appalled at the poverty and misery in France. And he said it was actually worse. The European peasant had it worse than the American slave, all because the rich nobles had grabbed up all the land and left lots of people begging. And he said, whenever there's unemployed poor people and idle land, the law of property has been carried beyond natural right. On the far right is Tom Paine. He made the proposal that brings together some of the things that we talk of now. His was the first Social Security proposal. And he started off by saying the life of an Indian is a continual holiday compared to the poor of Europe, but is abject poverty compared to the rich, and that our system of property and land divides people into rich and poor. And he proposed that everyone owes the community a ground rent for the land he holds, and he didn't propose to give this ground rent to the government for services. He said every person should get a grant when he's age 21. He should get a big piece of the rent to start him off in life. And then at age 50, he should get so much a year for the rest of his life, and this should all come out of the rent. So this was the first Social Security proposal. There's also a proposal for a basic annual income. And the best sources of a basic annual income are ground rent, because it won't cause inflation, and because people are already getting something for nothing. The ground rent is going to title holders who got nothing but a piece of paper from the government, so it would just go to everybody. And the other source is the issuance of new money. This was picked up in a very big way by the progressives after the Civil War. And Benjamin Franklin, who's the second from the right, a famous American revolutionary, wrote to somebody and said, I have not forgotten my political economy, but all our legislators are landowners. And they are not yet persuaded that all taxes come out of land anyhow, and so we've been forced into the use of indirect taxation. And the youngest fellow, that's William Penn. He's not actually, this was the American section. He's much more famous as an American, but he only visited the United States. What made him, what they told me in school, they left out the good part of the story. They told me that that William Penn was given the state of Pennsylvania as his property in payment of a debt of 13 million pounds owed to his father by the king. And that was awfully generous of the king. But it turns out that William Penn was preaching against the Church of England. He was a Quaker Society of Friends, and he was preaching against the Church of England, and they threw him in jail, and a jury refused to convict. And this is the birth of jury nullification, what we call jury nullification, which is the jury can just decide that even though you did what the law says is wrong, the jury thinks the law is wrong, and they're just not going to convict. And the trial was held by the Lord Mayor of London. So he was the mayor and also a judge. I guess they were pretty loose about those things. And he instructed the jury to go back and render a proper verdict, and 2 of the jurors refused and stayed in jail for a year. And there was a big agitation, and eventually higher courts in England ruled that you could not punish a juror for giving you a verdict you don't like. And that was the birth of jury nullification, and William Penn was therefore more or less free to preach heresy against the Church of England. And so I think the king thought it would be a good thing to get him and his Quakers to Pennsylvania and out of his hair. So that's the part of the story I didn't know about when I was at that time. These are more the classical progressives. After the Civil War, now the Progressive Party was Republican. The Republican Party was formed as the Radical Progressive Party, and I have to repeat that a couple times because nobody believes it. But what happened was the Democratic Party was a slave party. The Whig Party was the other party, and they were captured by the banks and the Northern industrialists. And all the abolitionist parties and the parties of the Western settlers came together and formed several small parties. The largest of them was called the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party had like 18 or 20 planks, and 12 of them were about slavery. But 2 of them were about the land should be given in grants to small settlers, and that we opposed the sale of land to large corporations and speculators. And then another plank was that the government should separate itself from banks and not have any interactions with banks. So the things we're talking about here were at the center of the American progressive movement that grew out of the abolitionist movement. And when you talk about progressives in the original sense, they're not like that anymore, but the original progressives grew out of the abolitionist movement, and they were much more, their bias was find a privilege and abolish it. It was never find a program to protect the poor from the rich. They said find the privilege that's making the rich rich. They had a very different view. They went back to the classical liberal writings of Adam Smith and Ricardo and Locke. And to them, capital meant one thing. If labor produces something, it's wealth. If labor did not produce it, it isn't wealth. And if it isn't wealth, it can't be capital, because capital is wealth that you use to produce more wealth. So I can go out and pick berries and take them home and eat them. But if I make a basket, not just for myself, but for the purpose of being able to pick up more berries so I can take them into town and sell them or whatever, that basket is capital in a very trivial sense. So factories and machinery and those things were what the classical liberals considered to be legitimate capital. And most other things are capitalized privilege. And if you have to figure out something's value by capitalizing it, it's not capital. Something can be sanitized, it's not sanitary. If a citizen can be naturalized, it means he's not a natural citizen. You naturalize the ones who were not born there. You don't naturalize. So true capital, you don't figure out its value by capitalizing a flow. True capital has a production cost. And that's the difference. So most of the things that we attack when we attack capitalism, the classical progressives and the classical liberals would say, no, that's not capital at all, that's privilege. and you've capitalized its value. If you own land, you are wealthy, not because you have wealth, but because you can claim wealth. And that was a core factor for them. But these were William Lloyd Garrison was the leading abolitionist. He went to Ireland and said the system in Ireland is exactly the same is essentially the same as chattel slavery. The English just took all the land, so the Irish had no choice but to work for them. Abraham Lincoln, on the end, said that once we've done with chattel slavery, we have to get rid of the land sharks and land grabbers. Mark Twain wrote lots of stuff about, the reason Cecil Rhodes is so popular is everybody thinks he wants the earth, wants it for himself, and the belief that he will get it and cut his friends on the ground floor is the thing that holds him in the zenith. Then he said, I frankly admire him, and when his time comes, I shall buy a piece of the rope as a keepsake. Benjamin Butler is famous for pushing greenback currency. So all the currency advocates, I have some things on my website by Benjamin Butler. He is very good. Terence Powderly, down in the lower left, was the head of the Knights of Labor, which was the first labor union. And he didn't come up with it, but he endorsed a statement by somebody in his union that we wouldn't need unions if it wasn't for banking privilege. So Clarence Darrow later said that the impossible task of unions is to prop up their side to offset the propping up of the other side, and that the right thing to do is to knock out the props. And this fellow in the cartoon is Henry George. I'm the president of the Council of Georgist Organizations, so I have a little more latitude with. This was a cartoon in a paper that didn't like him, and he's holding up a globe called the United Labor Party, and if you could zoom in on it, they were all fighting with each other. Let's see if okay. Capitalism is that almost everything goes to the private sector and a little slice goes to society. So the rent, wages, and interests all go to the private sector and a little bit goes to society. And communism is just the opposite. Most of it goes to society and a little bit goes to the individual. Socialism is kind of in between. But Henry George's thing, which this was put together by a Georgist, but it's more generally progressivism, is that land rent goes to society. Land rent includes extraction royalties from minerals. It includes licenses to the electromagnetic spectrum. And the wages and interest go to the individual laborer and capitalist. The interest is not a return to capital, it's actually a return to the artificial shortage of capital. Once you free people to produce as much capital as they want, they produce capital. As long as it returns any interest, they keep producing more. And when it returns zero interest, they just produce enough to maintain it. So capital, the return to capital, which the classicals called interest, disappears. The return to money is kind of a rent, because if they maintain an artificial shortage of debt-free money, then it's a return to privilege, and it becomes something more like rent, as somebody was talking about earlier. Anyhow, the right thing to do, according to these people, is for government to issue all the money, for government to run certain businesses they called natural monopolies, and they basically boiled down to a right-of-way monopoly. Most streetcar lines, water lines, sewer lines, gas and electric, telephone, all of those things don't make any sense to try to do with free, open competition, because the real cost is stringing a network through right-of-ways, and government has to grant you the right-of-way. And so they all argued that these right-of-ways should belong to the government. So just like with roads, you can have private trucks on public roads. Airports have private planes flying into public airports, and there's air traffic controllers. Trains could do that. The government would have traffic controllers, but you could privately run a train on the government's tracks. But it has to either be totally open competition or totally government. They did not like public-private partnerships at all. Public-private partnerships is the public usually gets the short end of it. The analogy from the classical liberals, they used to say, a fair field and no favor, which is a sports metaphor. And so the role of government is like the role of referees. They are there to ensure that it's a good game, that it's a fair game, that nobody's got an unfair advantage, and that it's not a brutal game. They're there to prevent injuries. So the rules in a sports thing are meant to minimize the injuries, maximize the value of the game, and to keep it fair. And that was, and when it can't be done fairly by the private sector, then the private sector shouldn't do it. So anyhow, all of these things lead us to what the government should do, and they also lead us to the reality that the government isn't going to do it, because at least the central government. And the reason for that is that the progressive movement was huge in the 1880s, and everybody understood this. Now I'm talking to people and they're like, I've not heard this before. But when everybody in the United States knew exactly what these arguments were, the influential people managed to prevent it from happening. So then the question is, how do you make it happen? And that's where land trusts come, and community banking and local currencies come into play, because all of these are inferior to the government doing it right. If the government issued currency directly into the market, made it where it's careful to avoid inflation, and cut out the big banks, we wouldn't even be having this conversation about creating alternate currencies. It would just not be necessary. And at the same time, if government taxed land, we wouldn't need to talk about land trusts. But as they don't, we have these land trusts. The most successful one was started by Georges 100 years ago. There were a bunch of them started, and they all had various failures. And this one is Arden, Delaware. All of these streets are, this is right on the edge of near Pennsylvania. It's like the first exit in Delaware. And there's about 4,000 people living in this community. The census tract data gives them like 4,500, but I've been told some of them are not actually in Arden. Half the land is open commons, including a good bit of, you can't see it on the screen very well, but there's quite a lot of wooded area in there, and there's a big town square. They have guild halls. The first thing they did when they started this thing, this is a lot of land trusts were started by people who had a particular vision of how things should be, either a Mondrigan socialistic kind of vision or a particular religion or whatever. And Arden just said, we will have none of this. We will welcome everyone. So the entrance, their motto, which is on this pedestrian entrance, and I don't think you can read it, but it says, Arden, you are welcome hither. And anybody is free to use the commons in Arden. The people who don't live in Arden go and use all of the open commons. The facilities are they're more run as clubs. So they have a swimming club and a can
you please read the text there?
Oh, it says, you are welcome hither, which means here. Arden was named after a Shakespearean play, As You Like It. There was an Arden in As You Like It, and the founder of this was a Shakespearean. The game Monopoly was invented by someone who lived in Arden. It was originally called the landlord's game, and there were two sets of rules. There was the prosperity rules and the monopoly rules. And the prosperity rules had an honest system of money issuance, and it had a land value tax. And then the monopoly rules were the predatory rules. So, but the first thing they built in Arden was this library. Arden is, most communities, they intend the communities for richer people, and the richer people move in and they try to keep the poor people out. And then over years, as the community declines, it attracts more and more poor people. But Arden started off attracting poor people. There were people living in tents and shacks. Some of the richer people went there for the summer because it was along the railroad from New York, but they ended up with a lot of poor people, and it gradually got richer. And this brings up one of the problems with Arden today, because Arden is a huge success in terms of it's a very desirable community. But the purpose of Arden was to collect the rent instead of taxes, to keep real estate affordable, and to use that rent money to buy up more land. And if we go back up to the top, down here is Arden Croft, and over there is Arden Town. Arden got a donation from a rich, wealthy soap magnate named Joseph Fells. And when they found additional land they could buy, they had to go and get additional donations because they had not been collecting the full rent. If they had been collecting the full rent, they would have had the money to buy this other land. And this is 114 years old. If they had been collecting the full rent all along, the state of Delaware would be smaller than the holdings of the Arden Single Tax Corporation. There's some reasons why you need to collect the full rent. This is one of the older, it's not a good, I think we have a lot of light in this room. It's kind of a normal cottagey kind of house, and there's a lot of houses like this in Arden. But they did two things. One is they decided to only collect the rent that they needed, which meant that the leases started selling for big money. And the other is that they passed zoning laws. So when a place is attractive, you can either bring more people into smaller places or the price goes way up. And because they did zoning, the price went way up. So we now get places like this, which is on the same street as that other place. More and more, it is more expensive to buy a lease in Arden than to buy a deed in the surrounding communities. So you cannot keep the rent low because rent is just a reality. And what happens is when you keep the rent low, it helps the people who are already there, but the next person pays that. And this is where capitalized privilege comes in. Whatever the rent is that the person expects to keep for himself and not pay to the community, which is the private rent, if you divide that by what you expect the interest rate to be over the next 20 years, you get the land price. And this is a standard textbook stuff. This is not like geoclassical theory. That the price of real estate goes up when the interest rate goes down. And when most of the lending is for home purchases, you're not really making it easier for people to get homes so much as you're making it easier for people to sell homes at a higher price. But because Arden doesn't collect the rent, the person who wants to move into Arden not only has to pay a capitalized value of the actual rent, but he has to pay a capitalized value of the expected rent, which is much higher. So when people think the price is going to go up in the future, it goes up now. And this is fundamentally the problem that all these private land trusts have had. Now, somebody sued, the Georgists went and sued Arden because their charter says that they have to collect the full rent. And the judge said, well, if Arden did collect the full rent, would it go to you? And they said no. And he said, well, then you have no standing in court. As a nonprofit corporation, whatever it decides to do is, no matter what the charter says, it does not say how the rent would go to anybody in particular, so therefore you don't have a claim to sue to make sure that they collect it. and it's called standing. That's why, as I looked at lots and lots of land trusts, they all had this problem. Some of them, this was an undesigned community. Some were beautifully designed. The garden cities in England, Letchworth and Bryn Gwylyd, were very well designed, and they had the same problem. They failed to collect the full rent, and in their case it was not for profit, but somebody came in and bought up shares and took the land away from them, and they very quickly incorporated into a municipality and liquidated. So I looked at this and I came up with the idea that if you have it for profit and the owners or the shareholders have a legal right to demand that you collect the full rent, even if they only get a small fraction of that rent for themselves, it's enough to have standing so that your land trust will always be true to its obligation, the larger obligation to collect the full rent and to buy additional land so that other people can come on. Now, a conventional landlord collects all the rent and keeps it. And of course the taxes he has to pay the taxes, but actually in the leases, in most leases, if the taxes increase, say you have a commercial property and you build a building and you're on a long-term lease, usually the lease says if the taxes increase, the tenant has to pay a rent increase to match it. So the taxes are on the tenant. In this land trust, if we look at the bottom, it says taxes on land value and the cost of assessing and administrating the trust. That all comes out first. And then what's left over, half goes to dividends. And the land fund gets a percentage, that's to buy more land. And the land and the amenities and rebates, in other words, if you build here, we will pay your building tax out of that. And if we have any more money and we can pay some of your wage tax that you earn here, or if you have a business and we can pay some of your business tax, we will do that. And I call that's a good growth because it'll cause economic growth. But the higher growth is simply that the amenities and rebates, the amenities are things you can apply this rent fund to provide a library, to provide childcare. If you're in Sweden and the government provides these things, you use more of this fund for tax rebates and you let the government do it. But if you're in a country that provides very little, you can provide it as a land trust. And you'll have less taxes to rebate. So it's up to the people there to decide how to divvy that up. And then the land fund is still 20% and the dividends are only 20%. But if you can turn a poor area into a rich area, or not rich in that multimillionaires live there, but if you can take a distressed area and turn it into an area with lots of jobs and work and stuff, that's 20% of that is more than the full rent. You can create a small village in a farming community and 20% of that village is worth more than the whole farm. And if you do it right, you will have a good relationship with the surrounding farmers because your villagers will be able to buy products there. There is a rent protection in this, and the brown line is that the rent can only go up so much a year, but that protection, you only get that protection because you've made improvements. So if the difference between the market rent and your protected rent gets so great that the protection is worth more than your improvements, then that orange section is because you lose that protection. You can get it back if you improve your building. So that's the trust government is based on juries, just because juries work better. Most of my right-wing friends, they absolutely don't trust democracy, but I say, well, do you trust a jury? Oh yes, juries are important. So what we said is, what if you took all the shareholders, and if the biggest shareholder, most companies, one shareholder owns half of it, so he absolutely controls it. if you're going to say we're going to select 6 jurors to make this decision, and we'll draw a lottery according to your shares, well, the biggest shareholder, if he owns half, he has 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. He has 63 out of 64 times. He's going to be one of the jurors, but just one. So he no longer controls anymore. This is a good compromise between $1, 1 vote, and 1 person, 1 vote. And it saves a lot of the problems with the corporate system. And then there's a leaseholders jury. And depending on the value of your land, you get, if you're a big leaseholder, you have a better chance of being on the jury, but it's still done at random. And then there's a jury of residential occupants and a jury of workers and employers, and they have different functions. And that's something more in terms of the internal model. But the big reason to use juries is that the essence of democracy is deliberation. And especially in the United States, our elections are not about deliberation. They're propaganda wars. And whoever wins the propaganda war usually is the one who had the most corporate money to do it. So the idea of having juries make these decisions enables you to have a larger system. You know, somebody said the banking system has to be small enough to be democratic. And the idea of a jury is it can deliberate, even if there's 1 million people, if you're picking them truly at random and you set 12 people down and you say, you sort this out and you render a verdict and that's what we'll do, then you have that deliberative quality that normal democracy only has in small communities. And there are some things that are joint decisions. Some things you cannot do unless the leaseholder, unless everybody agrees. And one is you can't amend the charter, you can't change the land use laws, and you can't sell trust land. So the trust is, just like if you have a mortgage, you can't sell your land because the bank has a lien on the mortgage. And until the bank and you agree, you can't sell the land, or until you pay them off.
Sorry,
yeah.
a short break because the people here can't see.
Well, I'm so close to the end, I don't know if it matters. Yeah, let me just... Yep, that's the end of the show. One thing I wanted to add is a land trust can issue currency. And a land trust currency is more stable than any of the currencies that are issued by local exchange systems and everything, because you can lien the land trust against the currency. So people say, okay, so say you want to do Bitcoin. If Bitcoin, or TradeCoin, if TradeCoin is sponsored by the land trust, then there's a rule that even if you don't have faith in TradeCoin and your biggest fear is what if people stop accepting TradeCoin, the land trust is obliged by its charter to not liquidate or not dissolve or not refuse to redeem the currency, because the currency is backed by the land of the thing. So you can always, if you can't do anything else with this money anymore because other people decided not to play with it, you can always redeem it by paying rent in the trust. And even if you don't live in the trust, you can always engage in trade with somebody who does. And the advantage to the trust, they don't have to collect interest, they don't even have to collect fees for processing. The trust, the land value of the trust will go up because of the trade and the greater availability of money. So I should stop now anyhow, and let whoever's in charge of this figure out what goes on next. Thank you.
Why do you think we should have a land trust here in Motala or East Sweden? Yeah, it's on.
Yeah. You have to eat the mic.
Yeah, I know.
Well, it mostly depends on whether you can get hold of land that is grossly underused. And it also depends on whether government, I mean, if your government can levy a land value tax, then the main reason for a trust would be to issue currency, I think. But land is the natural backing of currency, even government currency. The fact of the matter is that you can only collect a tax if people desire to live there. So no matter what the tax is, this is John Locke's point, all taxes eventually come out of rent. So land naturally backs currency. And the people who do currency in other ways are handicapped because they don't have something. You know, you have each person promises to fulfill his obligation to redeem his currency. And that's good, but it's not absolutely reliable because the person could die. The person could just renege on it and say, I'm not going to, or become unable to. And land, if you have good rentable land, that never happens. So the rent flow is forever, and the currency, there's a limit on how quickly you can redeem the currency, but you always know that ultimately the currency will be redeemed. So the models, the trade coin models and other are excellent models for it, but anchoring them with land makes them more stable. And if the land trust simply issues the currency the way government should, and does it in a way that it's careful not to create inflation, then nobody has to be obligated to redeem the currency. Nobody else has to be obligated. The trust will redeem the currency. I don't think that land trust can make a currency really fly unless it's a big trust or a confederation. If there were several of these trusts going on, they could do that. If there was a trust in Gothenburg and a trust in Motala and trusts in various places in Sweden, and some of them were agricultural producers and some of them were industrial producers and some of them were commercial centers, the money would just circulate very, very well. And because it's debt-free money, people would borrow less. So that's a good reason, even if you can get the government to do land value tax. But the best reason is that you get rid of the disincentives of taxation against production, and you turn them into disincentives against land speculation. So that when the Saab plant closes down, the government doesn't have to rush in and try to save it. The Saab owners will say, well, we will give this plant away because we can't sit here and speculate. We can't sit here and pay this tax while we hope somebody rescues it. So we will just give it away. And then the next person to do it pays so little that maybe he can make it work without government help.
And we have this huge infrastructure project on the go here in East Sweden. It's called the East Link, a huge railway system connecting East Sweden to Stockholm, a high-speed railway. And of course, as you pointed out, infrastructure projects raises land value.
Yes.
So there will be a lot of money from the government going into land values here, our land values. And of course that will make housing more expensive, right?
Yes,
according to your theory?
Yeah, there's a new line in London, new transit line in London called the Jubilee Line, which is a subway in the center city and a surface out toward the neighborhood it serves. And land values went up by 13 times the cost of the subway. The metro system in Washington, D.C., when they built it, the land values went up 4 times the cost of the metro. So when you pay if you rent an apartment near the subway station, you're already paying your landlord more than the cost of your share of riding the subway. And then you're paying to ride the subway, and then your taxes paid to build the subway. So you're paying 3 times. You're paying your landlord, you're paying your fare, and you're paying the taxes to make the subsidy. And if you're not riding the subway, you're still paying twice. So what this is the idea that if the land value paid for the subway, then you might pay more if it was a fare. Tom Johnson, who was one of the great progressives, he's the guy who I mentioned earlier, he was the hero of the Johnstown flood rescue effort. I think it killed 2,000, 3,000 people in Johnstown. He became the mayor of Cleveland, and he made a fortune in streetcar monopolies. He was a monopolist, and he read some books by Henry George and dedicated his life and his millions and millions of dollars to fighting streetcar monopolies as well. And he tried to give his streetcars away, and people were suspicious. He only owned 40%, and he said to Detroit, if you buy the streetcar line, you can have my 40% for free. And my partners, you just have to buy out my partners. And they thought it was a trick. So they refused to pay $16 million. So the next year they sold it for $25 million. But he became the mayor of Cleveland. And he said streetcars should be free. Elevators are free. You don't pay, when you get into a building, you don't give somebody a nickel or put a nickel into the coin thing so you can go up the elevator. The rents, they're not really free. The rents pay for them. The owner of the skyscraper charges rent to the people on the upper floors. He couldn't get any rent at all above maybe the 4th or 5th floor if he didn't have an elevator. So now he can get rent to the 30th floor because he has an elevator. The rent naturally pays for the elevator. Transit system is like an elevator, except it's horizontal instead of vertical. And the rents would naturally pay for it if we levied it that way. And everybody, they wouldn't have to have fare takers on the elevator, on the transit. You'd have somebody to drive it, and that's it.
So we could use land trusts in order to get funding for lower prices on our buses and our trains?
You could if it was very large. You could possibly, if you had, this E-link is very long, possibly there's a place where they say, well, we weren't going to build a station here, we were just going to go straight through. And the land trust could say, if we put up some money, will you build a station here? Because our land value will go up by more than the cost of stopping the train. And additionally, if we put up more money, can our people ride for free? Now you're trying to market, you're trying to get people to build in your land trust community, and you're telling them, you are the only people in the world or in the country that can ride free to Stockholm or ride free to Motala or wherever this train goes. You can ride free because we paid your fare in advance. And that could work. I think that is more likely that you'll get a land trust somewhere where they weren't even going to build a stop. That's where you'll get the land cheap. If they already planned to build a stop there, some land speculators have already run in and bid up the price of land, and you're not going to get a good deal on the land. So the best place for a land trust is where you're below the threshold that attracts the land speculators, and the trust creates a change in that, and the land becomes viable because of it.
Well, and this project is about work-integrated social cooperatives, a big chunk of it anyway. So how could this scheme promote work-integrated social cooperatives?
I think it just mostly removes the predatory incentives. So in some ways it makes the cooperatives easier to put together, and in some ways it makes them less necessary. So it makes ordinary capitalists more cooperative naturally without a cooperative institution. But it also makes the cooperative institutions work better because they're not up against the internal struggles. You have cooperatives, you know, in the Soviet Union, which was hardly cooperative because it was run from the top down, but when it broke up, the people who controlled the coal and the minerals, they ended up being the dominant people and they became the capitalists. But even under communism, the factory workers did not have nearly as much power as the mine workers, because the mine workers were producing wealth in addition to what their labor was creating. They were bringing wealth out of the ground and getting a royalty on that. So even in the United States, the powerful unions are the ones that are tight with an employer. You know, the auto workers were very powerful when we had patent monopolies and you couldn't really sell foreign cars in the United States, except at a great handicap. The steel workers, when steel was dominant and we had tariffs on imported steel and all that stuff, steel workers were very powerful. And sometimes they made partnerships with their capitalist employers to support things that were bad for the people, but they were good for the monopoly. And if it's good for the monopoly, now we as laborers can negotiate for a higher wage, so we get a higher pay than somebody who works in an industry that doesn't have a monopoly. So our unions in the United States are not, they don't have the concept of one big union and the brotherhood of all workers. Every union is fragmented and is into his own little interest. And that happens more when there's monopoly. So if you create these land trusts, that at least within the trust, all the monopoly advantages are you pay rent for your monopoly advantage and it's shared by everybody. It just gets rid of that friction.
Yes?
If you compare this system with the land rent taxation with this that was proposed by Sylvia Gesell, who in Austria, when they in the town Wörgl, where they said that the Kommun should own the ground and then just have a bidding for which part of land you wanted to use.
Mm-hmm.
I think this seems more simple and less administrative work than the thing you have presented here. Can you give a comment?
I would do bidding. When the land is vacant, we shouldn't bother assessing the value. We should just say, who wants this land and who will pay the highest rent? So you don't bid a price. Like in conventional auctions, you bid a price and you buy the land. We just say, you bid a rent. And we will adjust the rent over time according to what other people bid on similar land. But we really don't have to. The reason you assess the land value instead of bid on it is that once somebody builds a building, the building is private property and the land belongs to the community. Now I can't, I shouldn't have, yeah, but I shouldn't have to bid on, if somebody comes and says, I will bid a higher thing on this land, I say, wait, my building is on this land. So what are you going to pay me for the building if you bid? You either have to assess the building or assess the land, because if you're going to outbid me on the land, you also have to buy my building. So assessing is for improved property. Vacant property can just be bid upon. It's really, assessing is a service to protect the building owner. It's not really. We wouldn't do it if it wasn't. If you had a community garden, everybody had a plot of land in their community garden, you could put those plots up for bid every year. But if somebody has done a lot of work and put raised beds and bricked in or something so that they have a much better, their section of the garden is much better than everybody else's, Well, now there's some ownership there too. And that's when you avoid subjecting them to just a bid.
They have this, usually when they use it now in Sweden, they have you can have contract of 49 years and sometimes 99 years.
So it's a lease, yeah. Arden has a 99-year lease, but you renew it the first year for another 99 years.
Not yet.
You don't have to. But if you have a 49-year lease, say, and you say, I don't like the new rent assessment, one of the options that you can write into it is to say, well, here's what you agreed to, and if you don't like the new agreement, no, even if the group changes something, they change the zoning laws or something, say, okay, you didn't agree to that, and you have another 20 years on your lease, but we're not going to renew your lease because you're not with the community. So in some ways, if the community decides to do something a certain way and you say, I'm not going to do it that way, whether it's pay a higher rent or allow a different land use or prohibit a land use or something, you don't want to do it, maybe we'll have a 20-year lease and every year you can renew your lease, but you need to renew it the first year, otherwise you're serving notice that at the end of 20 years you're out of here. And it's hard to, it's one of those things, and coming from the United States where the individual is sacred and the community is just the community, there is no community, just a bunch of individuals. And I say, yeah, there is no individual, just a bunch of human cells, but they don't understand that. And so to them, the individual is everything. And I always say there's always got to be a way to balance the community and the individual. And one is to have shorter leases with a renewal system. And you sacrifice. If you go against the community, you sacrifice. You can, if you have a good reason to do it and you need to do it for another 20 years, you do it at the cost of at the end of 20 years, you have no standing anymore.
Another question.
Could you a little bit focus on or elaborate on the concept of community land trusts, focusing on affordable housing?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, people have tried artificial ways to make the housing affordable, and what happens in the United States is that there's either a lottery or there's an income guideline, and for 5 years the house cannot get on the market, so poorer people will move into this house and it's subsidies, and at the end of 5 years, then their deadline is up, they sell the house. And if a house is going up in value, if you picture 3 communities and they all have the same rent, one community is getting worse, one community is staying about the same, and one community is getting better, okay? And the rents are all the same. But the price is not based on the current rent, the price is based on the future rent. So the community that's getting better attracts rich people who are willing to pay more now to have something that'll be better in the future. Where the person he's just to the point where he can afford a home, but he's not to the point where he can play the market. And he says, well, the house in this average community I can barely afford, but I can really afford the house in the poor community because it's going downhill. So poor people tend to move into the poor communities to buy a home because they can get it cheap. Or what's worse is absentee landlords buy those houses and rent them out, and then the community gets worse faster. But when everybody is renting, you say, well, if you want to live in this community, first you have no land purchase price. You only have to build your house or find somebody to build you. So it's cheaper that way. Then out of your rent, we're going to rebate some taxes. You can design these taxes so you're only rebating the taxes poor people pay. And if you allow high density, you allow a larger number of people instead of more affluent people. The worst thing that Arden did to drive the poor out is they had zoning laws that you could not You could not subdivide these lots into smaller lots, and you could not build apartment buildings. People would love to live in an apartment building in Arden, and it's the people who are selling their leases, they have an interest in keeping poorer people out. So eliminating density zoning especially, there's some good reasons to allow commercial and not industrial necessarily, but commercial and residential together. There's some good reasons for that. People can live without cars and walk to the store and walk to work. But the main thing is that rents don't, when a community starts to get better, rents will go up like this and the selling price goes way up. So taking them out of selling does it. If it's a for-profit trust and people say, I want to have equity in my home, I want to buy my home, and when I retire I want to have equity, you can always buy shares in the trust that are roughly equal, more or less, doesn't matter, to the house you're renting or the land you're renting. So you don't speculate on your parcel of land. The whole trust, the value of the whole trust rises and falls together. One of the worst things for land speculation, there's a saying in real estate, the worst property on the block is the best investment on the block. Because all your neighbors have a nice block and you have the bad property. That's the best investment, because if you fix your property up, you've turned the whole block up. Where if you have a good property, there's nothing you can do to make it a good block, because whoever has the worst property has that control. And land speculation has this aspect that everybody wants everybody else to fix up the community. And if other people fix up the community, I profit. And if I fix up my property, you profit. And when you have a land trust, we all profit, or all the shareholders profit. And the shareholders have no control. The leaseholders and the residents and the workers, including the employers, have the control. So self-employed people are treated just like workers for the purpose of deciding things like where the bus stop should be, or those normal municipal functions. We let the residents do that, just like any other democracy. One of the problems with democracies, local democracies, is the residents have all the control, and the businesses have to make their case that what they're doing is good for the community and good for the residents. And so part of this, and these things are not essential. Some of, like the jury system is my idea. The existing trusts didn't have that. And they were successful. The only thing that I can really identify is they were not for profit. And so the individual landowners went back to collecting the profit. And that's the destructive part.
Could the government be the investor? I mean, the local municipality. So the profit goes to the municipality, and the rebates goes to the residents in the land trust.
It could be. It would be subject to all the same political shenanigans that other things are, and it would be, the residents would be putting pressure on the government to collect less rent so that they could speculate on their leases like they used to speculate on deeds. So if the government is capable of overcoming that political pressure, then a municipal government could do it. I think the best route for a municipal government is to get whatever permission it needs from Sweden. Do you have states in Sweden, or is it just one? It's just one country and then counties or something?
Regions and municipalities.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you can get permission to do a land value tax, you don't need...
We actually have a small land value tax in Sweden. It's called kommunal fastighetsskatt, eller fastighetsavgift, kommunal fastighetsavgift. It's a very small...
is it a local tax or a state tax?
It's a municipal, it's a tax, and the tax revenue goes to the municipality.
So do they have do they have the legal authority to increase that?
No, I don't think so.
So
We have the
that's-
parliamentarians here.
So if that's the case, the land trust route is
It's
ideal.
yeah, it might be. If we want this, then it might be. And also here in Motala we have this private company called Tillväxt Motala, which is owned by the local businesses. And you're talking about how to attract, rebating businesses.
Mhm.
So could the members of Tillväxt Motala invest in a land trust, and then we rebate taxes for businesses who wants to come and establish themselves here in Motala? Is that basically what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I don't know if I would give a special rebate to a new business. I think the existing businesses, if they can, it's called title pooling. And there are other people who, I've always conceptually thought it's much easier to find a piece of land and just do it than it is to get hundreds of people to agree to consolidate their titles. But if there's enough incentive, businesses that pool their titles can create something like TradeCoin. And the TradeCoin is backed by the fact that even if this business goes under, whoever leases this land next can pay his lease revenues with TradeCoin. So it just gives this underlying guarantee to a local currency. But there's, whatever, they can create all sorts of incentives for each other. A shopping mall is already a bit of a land trust because usually one person owns the mall and everybody in the shopping mall rents. And many of the services that are normally municipal services are provided by the shopping mall. He has a security police. He maintains the big parking lot and the escalators and the common walkway, and he does some zoning because he says all the food is going to be here and the shoe stores are going to be here. And if he does it intelligently, the mall is more successful. And he also, shopping malls, if your store does not remain open, your lease is void. You're gone. You shut down your store even due to distress, and you have like 2 weeks to get your stuff out of here. And they do that because it's deadly to a shopping mall to have vacant stores in the mall. And it's the same thing as to a business district in town, but the town doesn't have that kind of centralized ownership of the land.
And I was also thinking about your discussion here about why not only have the municipality own the land and collect rent like a normal way, right? Isn't that what they do in Hong Kong?
Yes, but they started out that way. In Hong Kong, from the very beginning, England paid rent to China, and then everybody else paid rent to England. And it's a little cumbersome. It's not exactly a land value tax because they don't assess the value. Some of it is lease rents that stay for the length of the lease. And then at the end of the lease, the land is worth way more than the old lease, and there's a sticker shock when you say, well, we had this lease for 99 years, and it's based on what this land was worth 99 years ago, and now it's worth about 2,000 times what it was worth 99 years ago. And so there are some adjustments that are very difficult with that system. But yeah, Hong Kong gets more of its revenue from land rent than anybody else, which is part of the reason it has lower taxes than anybody else, which is part of the reason it's become this big commercial center. And again, with all that land tax and land rent being collected by the government, real estate prices are still higher in Hong Kong than they are in many places. Hong Kong is notoriously expensive, and I always say it's like taking the weight off of a pressure cooker. The whole rest of the world has taxation holding down the economy. And then you get your tongs so you don't scald yourself, and take that weight off of one little spot and you just get this jet of steam. And that's the Hong Kong economy. If everybody did it, we wouldn't become 1,000 Hong Kongs. It would just become, probably it would be very hard on Hong Kong if everybody did it, because Hong Kong is overbuilt. We don't need any place to be that built.
Okay, I guess the time is up. Thank you very much.
Well, I will hang around, so thank you.